It was a war no one expected to last, yet 2 years after it began, it was blazing hotter than ever. By 1814, the British had finally defeated Napoleon in Europe. The old lion could now turn its full attention to the young cub across the ocean. With Europe quiet for the first time in a decade, battle-hardened British soldiers were free, and they were coming for revenge. Their plan was simple but ruthless: strike at the very heart of America. Not just the ports or the forts, but the capital itself, Washington, D.C. As the summer heat rolled over the Chesapeake Bay, a fleet of British ships appeared like ghosts on the horizon. The Americans were unprepared. Their capital was poorly defended, their army scattered, and their leaders confident that no one would dare attack the city. But the British had something to prove. Under the command of Major General Robert Ross and Admiral George Cockburn, they landed thousands of redcoats and began marching inland. Towns fell, militia fled, and panic spread like wildfire. President James Madison himself rode to the front lines to rally the troops, the first and only time in U.S. history that a sitting president led men into battle. At Bladensburg, just outside Washington, the two forces clashed. The Americans fought bravely, but were no match for the experienced British troops. Within hours, the battle was lost. The road to Washington was open. As night fell on August 24, 1814, the British Army marched into the capital. It was eerily silent. Most residents had fled. Only the wind carried the echo of distant hoofbeats and the crackle of torches. Then, in one of the most shocking moments in American history, British soldiers set fire to the public buildings, the Capitol, the Treasury, the Arsenal, and finally, the White House itself. Imagine the scene: the night sky glowing red, the smoke rolling over the city, the flames licking the marble columns of the president's mansion. First Lady Dolly Madison had barely escaped hours earlier, saving a portrait of George Washington that would have been lost forever. When the British officers entered the White House, they found a dinner table set for a grand feast, food still warm, wine still on the table. They sat down, toasted to Madison's health, and then ordered the place burned to ashes. The fire consumed the heart of the young republic, and the world watched in disbelief. But fate has its own sense of justice. The next day, a massive storm rolled in, a hurricane, some said, with tornadoes that ripped through the British camps. Lightning struck, cannons rolled, and the fires were quenched by torrential rain. Some Americans called it divine intervention, as if nature itself refused to let the flame of their nation die. The British, realizing they had made their point, withdrew from Washington soon after. The city was left smoldering, its monuments blackened, its pride shattered. Yet in that destruction, something powerful was born: unity, defiance, and the determination to rebuild. Across the countryside, Americans were enraged. The burning of their capital became a rallying cry. From farmers to sailors, from politicians to poets, everyone now felt the same surge of patriotism. "They burned our house, now we'll make them regret it," one soldier said. Even those who had doubted the war now believed it was a fight for survival, not just for territory or trade, but for the nation's soul. The young United States, humiliated but unbroken, was about to strike back. Meanwhile, in Britain, the event barely made headlines. To many, it was a minor victory in a distant colony. Yet, history would remember it differently. The burning of Washington wasn't just the destruction of a city. It was the moment America's identity was tested by fire. A nation that had once rebelled against its parent now stood on its own, scarred but alive. The British thought they had taught a lesson. Instead, they had awakened something far more powerful: the spirit of a future superpower. The ashes of Washington whispered a promise. The war was far from over. Ahead lay one of the most legendary defenses in American history, a battle that would give birth to a song, a symbol, and a sense of unity that even the British could not destroy. The War of 1812, the family feud that forged a superpower. The flames that consumed Washington still smoked when the British turned their eyes north, toward Baltimore. If Washington was the brain of America, Baltimore was its heart. A bustling port full of shipbuilders and privateers, it was the beating center of American resistance. From there, daring sailors had raided British ships, capturing prizes and mocking the Royal Navy. The British were furious. To them, Baltimore was a nest of pirates that had to be destroyed. But to the Americans, it was the last line of defense and the place where their nation's pride would either perish or rise again. In early September 1814, the largest British invasion force of the war gathered off the Chesapeake. Over 50 warships filled the horizon, bristling with cannons. Redcoats landed at North Point, while the fleet prepared to bombard the city's main shield, Fort McHenry, a star-shaped fortress guarding the entrance to Baltimore Harbor. Inside its thick walls stood about 1,000 men under Major George Armstead, armed with courage, muskets, and a single flag so large it could be seen for miles. It was more than cloth. It was a message that America would not fall without a fight. On September 13th, dawn broke to thunder. British ships opened fire, launching over 1,500 bombs and rockets at the fort. For 25 straight hours, the sky was lit with streaks of red and white flame. The explosions shook the ground, smoke choked the air, and the defenders clung to their positions, praying that the walls would hold. Far out in the harbor, watching from a truce ship, was an American lawyer named Francis Scott Key. He had come to negotiate the release of a prisoner, but now found himself trapped, a witness to history's storm. All night he watched the relentless bombardment, each flash revealing glimpses of that giant flag still flying over the ramparts. Inside the fort, men fought exhaustion and fear. Supplies ran low, and parts of the ramparts crumbled under the rain of shells. Yet when British Marines tried to move closer under the cover of darkness, they were met with deadly cannon fire. The Americans refused to yield. As the night wore on, lightning flashed across the sky, mixing with the glow of rockets. Somewhere in the distance, Key whispered a desperate question that every American was thinking. "Oh, say, does that star-spangled banner yet wave?" Then, at dawn, the shelling stopped. The air fell eerily silent. Smoke hung thick over the harbor. Key strained his eyes through the haze, waiting for the wind to clear it. Slowly, as the morning light broke, he saw it, the same enormous flag still waving proudly. Over all odds, Baltimore had held. The British fleet withdrew, their invasion shattered. What they thought would be an easy victory had turned into humiliation. The defenders of Fort McHenry had done more than save a city. They had given birth to a legend. That night, inspired by what he had seen, Francis Scott Key scribbled a poem on the back of a letter. Its words captured the moment. "Oh, say, can you see, by the dawn's early light?" Those lines would soon become a song, and that song would become the anthem of a nation. The Star-Spangled Banner wasn't written in triumph. It was written in relief, exhaustion, and pride born from survival. It told the story of a people who refused to bow, no matter how powerful the enemy. News of Baltimore's defense spread like wildfire. Across the country, the burning of Washington was forgotten, replaced by tales of courage and resistance. American morale soared. Even in Britain, newspapers began to speak of the stubborn courage of the Americans. The war that had begun as a test of pride was turning into a lesson in respect. The old lion had roared, but the young republic had refused to kneel. Yet the war was not over. Across the Atlantic, peace talks were beginning in a small Belgian town called Ghent. Diplomats from both nations met to end the conflict that neither side could truly win. But before peace would come, one final clash, one of the most incredible battles in American history, would shape how the world remembered this war forever. It would take place in the swamps of the South, where a future president would rise from the smoke and chaos, turning defeat into destiny.
While diplomats negotiated peace in Europe, war still thundered in America's south. The British, determined to land one last decisive blow, turned their focus to New Orleans, the gateway to the Mississippi River and the trade lifeline of the western frontier. If they could capture it, Britain could strangle America's economy and claim victory even after the treaties were signed. But standing in their path was one man, Andrew Jackson, a tough, fiery general known as Old Hickory, a name that matched his unbreakable will. Jackson was not a polished officer. He was raw, ruthless, and relentless, a man forged in hardship who had once been slashed by a British officer's sword as a teenage prisoner during the Revolution. To him, this war was personal. As the British fleet advanced up the Gulf Coast in December 1814, Jackson rallied an unlikely army: frontiersmen, freed African Americans, Choctaw warriors, sailors, and even pirates led by the infamous Jean Lafitte. They spoke different languages and came from different worlds, but under Jackson's command, they stood united for one purpose: to defend their land. On January 8, 1815, as dawn broke over the Louisiana swamps, the British advanced through the mist toward the American lines. They came in perfect formation, redcoats gleaming, bayonets fixed, confident in their numbers and discipline. But Jackson had turned the swamp into a fortress. Behind mud ramparts and cotton bales, his men waited with cannons and long rifles. When the British marched within range, the Americans unleashed a storm of fire. Musket volleys, grape shot, and cannonballs tore through the ranks. Within minutes, chaos erupted. Officers fell, lines crumbled, and the field became a slaughter. It was one of the most lopsided victories in history. The British suffered over 2,000 casualties, including their commander, General Pakenham, while the Americans lost fewer than 100. Jackson's ragtag army had defeated the might of the British Empire. Church bells rang across the country. Newspapers called it a miracle. The irony? The Treaty of Ghent ending the war had already been signed in Europe 2 weeks earlier, but word had not yet reached America. The Battle of New Orleans changed nothing politically, yet it changed everything emotionally. It gave Americans pride, identity, and the belief that they could stand against any empire. To the British, it was a tragic miscommunication. To the Americans, it was divine destiny. Jackson became a national hero, his legend paving the road to the presidency. The victory transformed how the world saw the United States, not as a fragile republic clinging to survival, but as a nation capable of victory against the strongest military on the earth. Far from the gunpowder and chaos, in the quiet town of Ghent, Belgium, peace talks had been dragging on for months. The negotiators, British and American alike, were tired of war. Britain's treasury was drained from years of fighting Napoleon. America's trade was strangled, its cities burned, its people weary. Both sides had learned a hard truth: neither could truly defeat the other. When news arrived that Napoleon had fallen, Britain lost the reason for its maritime blockades. Suddenly, the very cause of the war, the impressment of sailors, faded away. On December 24, 1814, the Treaty of Ghent was signed. It restored relations to what they had been before the war. No land changed hands, no tribute was paid. It was, in many ways, a draw. Yet when the news finally reached America, it was celebrated like a triumph. After the humiliation of Washington's burning and the glory of New Orleans, the peace felt like victory. Church bells rang across the United States, crowds cheered President Madison, and the nation took its first deep breath in years. For Britain, the war had been a distraction, a sideshow compared to the vast European conflicts. But for America, it was a defining moment. It proved that the Republic could fight and survive against the most powerful empire on earth. More importantly, it forced Britain to respect its former colony as a legitimate nation. The two sides, once bound by resentment, were now tied by something unexpected: mutual recognition.
While great battles and headline-grabbing victories captured the imagination of nations, much of the War of 1812 unfolded far from the eyes of the world, in forgotten forests, frozen lakes, and isolated frontier outposts. Here, ordinary men and women bore the brunt of conflict, fighting under harsh conditions for reasons that historians would later struggle to fully capture. Along the Canadian border, small units of soldiers and Native American allies engaged in brutal skirmishes that tested courage, endurance, and loyalty. The great Shawnee leader Tecumseh, a visionary who had dreamt of a confederation of native nations united against American expansion, fell at the Battle of the Thames. His death was not only a military loss, but a devastating blow to the hope of a sovereign native identity. Across the northern forests, militia units struggled against harsh winters, unreliable supplies, and relentless British forces who knew the terrain almost as well as the locals. Disease, starvation, and exhaustion were as deadly as musket fire. Yet these unsung soldiers held their positions, often without recognition, driven by loyalty to their homes, communities, and fledgling nation. On the lakes, American privateers conducted daring raids on British merchant fleets, capturing ships, goods, and morale in equal measure. Their exploits, though smaller in scale than major battles, disrupted the lifeblood of British commerce and became legendary among coastal towns. Sailors who had never known battle became heroes in their own right, navigating treacherous waters with courage, wit, and audacity, showing that the fight for freedom extended beyond the battlefield into every corner of life. Meanwhile, civilians faced their own trials. Families fled towns under threat of attack, hiding in woods or along rivers, often without shelter, food, or security. Their resilience became a quiet testament to the human cost of the war, the sacrifices often overlooked in grand historical narratives. These forgotten fronts, where ordinary Americans and Native allies endured extreme hardship, bravery, and sometimes death, were crucial to sustaining the overall war effort, preventing Britain from achieving total domination. Though history often remembers generals, treaties, and iconic victories, it is these silent heroes, enduring hunger, cold, and uncertainty, who embodied the raw spirit of a nation under threat. Through the smoke of battles both grand and obscure, through the resilience of men, women, and Native allies, the War of 1812 was not only a test of military might, but a crucible that forged endurance, tenacity, and an emerging American identity. It was here, in the shadows and margins of the conflict, that courage took its most unheralded form, quietly shaping the future of a nation whose destiny would soon expand beyond its borders, proving that even in the smallest skirmishes, the spirit of a young country burned bright, resilient, and unyielding, echoing the larger narrative of survival, honor, and the will to endure. As the smoke of war began to clear and the cannons fell silent, America emerged transformed. The cities that had been burned, the forts that had endured bombardment, and the citizens who had faced starvation, disease, and chaos now shared a profound realization. Their nation had survived not merely as a political entity, but as a living, breathing symbol of courage and unity. From New England to the southern plantations, from frontier settlements along the Mississippi to urban centers on the Atlantic coast, a sense of shared identity began to coalesce. Citizens who had once thought of themselves primarily as residents of their states now recognized themselves as Americans, bound by a collective destiny forged in fire. This newfound national pride was not limited to soldiers or politicians. Women who had protected homes and families during British raids became symbols of resilience. Children who had witnessed the fear and chaos firsthand grew up with tales of bravery and determination that would echo for generations. Merchants who had seen their trade disrupted, farmers who had lost crops, and sailors who had faced the perils of both sea and enemy fire all contributed to a growing sense of unity.
a recognition that the survival of the nation depended on the courage and sacrifice of every individual. Newspapers carried stories of daring exploits, the defense of Fort McHenry, the victory at New Orleans, the resilience of towns like Baltimore and Plattsburgh, inspiring ordinary Americans to feel that they were part of something larger than themselves. Poets and writers celebrated the war in verse and prose, emphasizing not the destruction it had caused, but the heroism it had revealed. The arts became a vehicle for national expression, reflecting pride in a country that had defied an empire. Even in Britain, observers began to recognize the indomitable spirit of the Americans. Reports of courage, ingenuity, and determination filtered across the Atlantic, challenging old assumptions of the young republic as a fragile, rebellious colony. Respect, however grudging, began to replace disdain, and a mutual awareness of shared values, law, liberty, and civic responsibility started to emerge. The young United States, tempered by trials, was now a nation capable of self-respect, capable of standing up to the world's most powerful empire, and capable of cultivating a sense of unity and national pride that would carry it through future challenges. It was a pride born of struggle, endurance, and shared sacrifice. A pride that infused politics, commerce, education, and culture. Citizens began to embrace symbols that had survived the war, the flag, the anthem, the stories of bravery, seeing in them a reflection of their collective identity. This period marked the true birth of American nationalism, a confidence in sovereignty, an understanding of shared purpose, and the realization that the nation's destiny would be shaped not merely by treaties and negotiations, but by the courage and resilience of its people. The War of 1812, often dismissed as a forgotten war, had in truth carved the very foundation of a proud, unified, and enduring nation, setting the stage for America's emergence onto the global stage as a power to be reckoned with, confident, self-assured, and prepared to meet the challenges of the coming decades with a sense of purpose and unity, forged in blood and fire.
As the embers of battle cooled across the continent, the nations involved began to reflect on the lessons learned from years of conflict. America, a young republic tested in the furnace of war, discovered that survival demanded not just courage, but strategic vision, unity, and a recognition of its own limitations. While victories at Fort McHenry and New Orleans had become symbols of resilience and heroism, the quieter struggles along rivers, lakes, and forests revealed the profound human cost of war. Ordinary citizens enduring displacement, hardship, and loss, soldiers fighting under freezing conditions, and communities struggling to rebuild in the aftermath. Yet from this adversity arose a sense of mutual respect, not only among Americans themselves, but also across the Atlantic. Britain, which had underestimated its former colonies, began to acknowledge that the United States was no longer a fragile child of empire, but a sovereign nation capable of defending itself with ingenuity, determination, and courage. The war's paradoxical nature became clear. Through destruction and conflict, both nations had been forced to recognize qualities in the other that demanded respect rather than contempt. Diplomats in Ghent had negotiated peace, yet it was the lived experience of the war, the perseverance under fire, the endurance of hardship, the resilience of communities, and the brilliance of local leadership that had laid the groundwork for a new kind of international relationship. What had begun as a family feud fueled by pride, insults, and economic disputes was evolving into a mutual understanding. War had tested bonds, exposed weaknesses, and revealed strengths. And through this crucible, Americans and Britons were learning that cooperation could be more valuable than conflict.
The embers of Baltimore's ramparts, the muddy battlefields of New Orleans, and the scorched streets of Washington symbolized more than loss. They were markers of lessons learned, courage proven, and respect earned. The war, often overlooked in global history, was in fact an essential chapter in forging what would become enduring ties of diplomacy, trade, and cultural exchange. The people of both nations, while remembering the pain and destruction, also carried forward admiration and understanding, a recognition that history, however bitter, can teach the virtues of restraint, patience, and foresight. From the ruins of cities and the scars on landscapes rose a realization that shared values, law, liberty, and honor could bridge even the deepest divides. The War of 1812, though fought with fire and cannon, had sown the seeds of a strange friendship, a mutual recognition that enemies could become allies, and that through understanding, nations could find strength in unity rather than constant rivalry. In the quiet reflection after the last cannon's roar, the true victory of the war was revealed, the birth of insight, maturity, and the beginnings of a relationship that would endure for centuries.
From the aftermath of war emerged a concept that would one day be called the special relationship between Britain and the United States, though its true roots lay in mutual respect forged by fire, adversity, and shared history. Initially, both nations had engaged in the conflict out of necessity, pride, and a desire to assert their sovereignty or protect imperial interests. Yet as the smoke of battle faded, both realized that their future depended not on enmity, but on engagement. Diplomats, merchants, scholars, and travelers began to rebuild bridges that had been burned along with cities and forts. Intellectual exchange flourished as Americans studied British legal systems, literature, and philosophy, while Britain admired the boldness and ingenuity displayed by American citizens and military leaders alike. Trade routes reopened, and economic interdependence began to tie the Atlantic more tightly than ever before. Military rivalry gave way to strategic cooperation, as both nations recognized that a stable North America would benefit the empire and the young republic alike. The seeds of this relationship were sown in the war's crucible: respect for courage, acknowledgement of capability, and the understanding that confrontation could be avoided through negotiation, empathy, and mutual recognition. Cultural ties deepened with literature, music, and art, creating a shared Anglo-American heritage that would endure across generations. Families, too, were linked through immigration and shared ancestry, reinforcing bonds that had existed before independence, yet were now renewed through recognition of each other's strengths. The war had tested limits, but it had also taught lessons in restraint, diplomacy, and coexistence. By facing each other across battlefields and then across negotiating tables, both nations began to see that rivalry need not lead to lasting enmity. Over the decades that followed, this understanding evolved into a network of political, economic, and social connections that allowed Britain and the United States to become not only neighbors, but partners, allies in global matters, defenders of common values, and collaborators in shaping the modern world. The special relationship, centuries in the making, was rooted in the paradoxical truth that the fiercest conflicts can give rise to the deepest respect, that battles tested character, and that fire and struggle can forge enduring bonds between nations that once faced each other across cannon smoke and rivers of blood.
The decades following the Treaty of Ghent, America reflected on the war and recognized that its true significance extended far beyond the maps, boundaries, and naval battles. The war had been a proving ground for identity, resilience, and the principles that would define the nation for centuries to come. Ordinary citizens who endured the hardships of conflict became symbols of a collective courage that no army could erase. Soldiers, militia, sailors, and privateers had demonstrated extraordinary initiative, bravery, and ingenuity, often against overwhelming odds. Their victories, defeats, and sacrifices forged a new understanding of what it meant to be American. Likewise, Britain emerged with lessons about humility, patience, and respect for a rising republic that was no longer a distant colony, but an assertive, independent power.
The legacy of the war extended to governance, as American leaders recognized the need to strengthen institutions, fortify defenses, and cultivate diplomacy. National pride surged, fueled by stories of endurance, the survival of Washington, the defense of Fort McHenry, and the improbable triumph at New Orleans. Civic identity grew, shaped not just by victories, but by the moral and psychological fortitude displayed by citizens at every level. Communities that had faced the terror of invasion rebuilt not only their homes and streets, but also a shared cultural identity, weaving stories of heroism into the fabric of society. Monuments, songs, and annual commemorations immortalized the events of the war, ensuring that future generations understood the cost of freedom and the rewards of courage. The legacy was not merely military, it was philosophical and social. It reaffirmed that a nation's strength lies not only in armies and navies, but in the commitment, unity, and values of its people. America had tested itself, and the conclusion was clear. Survival demanded resilience, ingenuity, and moral courage. The War of 1812, once dismissed as minor or forgettable, had become a crucible for national character. It demonstrated that a nation, even a young and vulnerable one, could endure, learn, and grow through adversity, and that the lessons of courage, sacrifice, and identity would echo across centuries, shaping the ethos of a people destined to become a superpower. The remarkable transformation from enmity to alliance between Britain and the United States was perhaps the most enduring lesson of the conflict. What began as a bitter dispute over maritime rights, honor, and territorial ambitions evolved into a recognition that both nations' futures were intertwined. Britain, having faced the tenacity of the American forces and the resilience of its citizens, acknowledged the legitimacy of the young republic, while the United States realized the advantages of engaging with a global power as a partner rather than an adversary. Trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange blossomed in the decades following the war. Shared economic interests created interdependence, intellectual and artistic endeavors fostered mutual understanding, and strategic collaborations gradually replaced confrontation. Both nations learned that respectful rivalry could coexist with friendship, that common values could be celebrated without sacrificing sovereignty, and that a history of conflict could lay the foundation for trust. Through this careful evolution, the concept of the special relationship took root, long before it would be formally recognized in global politics. Families, immigrants, scholars, and leaders contributed to this dynamic, building bridges across oceans that had once been theaters of war. The story of rivalry transformed into a story of partnership, demonstrating that nations, like people, could evolve from animosity to cooperation when guided by respect, shared interests, and a willingness to recognize one another's strengths. It was a model for diplomacy, showing that even bitter enemies can become allies when necessity, history, and human insight converge. Britain and the United States, once separated by distrust and violence, now looked to each other not as threats, but as collaborators in shaping commerce, governance, and culture across continents. The lessons of the war extended beyond the battlefield, influencing foreign policy, national identity, and the moral imagination of both nations, and creating a blueprint for how historical rivals could evolve into enduring partners.
And so the war concluded not with a decisive conquest, but with a strange and paradoxical peace that would define both nations' futures. America emerged scarred, its cities rebuilt and its people resilient, yet strengthened by the trials endured. Britain, too, emerged with lessons of humility, respect, and recognition of a sovereign republic capable of standing toe-to-toe with the greatest empire on earth. The family feud had transformed into a relationship defined by caution, admiration, and a recognition of shared values. Monuments rose where fires had burned, flags flew where cannons had thundered, and anthems echoed where fear once reigned. The United States, forged in rebellion, tempered by war and validated through endurance, had solidified its place in the global order. Britain, now aware,
Even decades after the last musket fire and cannon blast faded from the American landscape, the echoes of the War of 1812 continued to reverberate across generations, shaping the consciousness of a nation and influencing the ways in which it engaged with the world. The war, often called the forgotten conflict by those outside the United States, remained deeply etched into the American psyche, a reminder of the young republic's resilience in the face of overwhelming odds. Stories of valor, such as the steadfast defenders at Fort McHenry, the ragtag militia and sailors under Andrew Jackson in New Orleans, and the countless unsung heroes who endured harsh winters, treacherous swamps, and relentless skirmishes along the Canadian border, became the foundation of a shared national mythology. Families passed down tales of ancestors who had fought, fled, or sacrificed, and these narratives cultivated pride and a sense of belonging. In towns and cities that had once been targets of British raids, citizens erected monuments, commemorated anniversaries, and celebrated acts of courage, ensuring that the legacy of endurance would not be forgotten. The war's imprint extended beyond mere memory, shaping American culture, politics, and identity for centuries to come. Politically, it demonstrated the necessity of strong institutions, centralized military preparedness, and a diplomatic presence that could negotiate effectively on the world stage. Citizens recognized that survival in an international context required not just bravery in battle, but strategy, coordination, and the foresight to balance ideals with practical realities. Economically, the conflict had spurred domestic manufacturing, local production, and the development of ports, shipyards, and trade networks that would strengthen the Republic in the long term. Cities rebuilt with resilience in mind, infrastructure improved, and a new appreciation for self-reliance and innovation emerged. Culturally, the war inspired music, poetry, and art that celebrated national identity. Francis Scott Key's Star-Spangled Banner became more than a song. It became a symbol of enduring hope, courage, and unity, a melody that resonated with the collective American spirit and reminded generations that even under the threat of annihilation, perseverance could triumph. Across the Atlantic, Britain reflected on the war with a blend of frustration and respect, recognizing that the Americans they had once considered rebellious children were now formidable, capable, and deserving of equality in the community of nations. This realization laid the groundwork for improved diplomacy, commerce, and cultural exchange. Travel, trade, and intellectual dialogue flourished, and a cautious partnership emerged that would evolve over the next century into the complex, interdependent relationship known today as the Anglo-American Alliance. The war's lessons, hard-won through fire and blood, became enduring principles. Courage is validated through endurance. Identity is forged in adversity, and rivalry can evolve into mutual respect. Even in schools, public discourse, and civic celebrations, the memory of the war reinforced the idea that national unity, grounded in shared sacrifice and collective resilience, was essential to the survival and growth of the Republic. Generations who followed learned that freedom demanded vigilance, that pride without responsibility was dangerous, and that relationships between nations, like those between people, required empathy, understanding, and foresight. In the quiet corners of history, in the letters of soldiers, the diaries of citizens, and the archives of policymakers, the War of 1812 left a profound legacy. The realization that a young nation could withstand the might of an empire, emerge confident in its identity, and build bridges across oceans to forge lasting partnerships. Its impact was more than military. It was philosophical, cultural, and moral, echoing across generations to teach Americans and Britons alike that adversity can be transformed into opportunity, rivalry into respect, and the chaos of war into the enduring architecture of diplomacy, identity, and collective memory.
The years following the conclusion of hostilities, the young United States, once perceived by Britain and the rest of the world as a fragile, experimental republic, began to assert itself with a newfound confidence and sense of purpose. The fires that had razed Washington, the bombardments that had tested Baltimore, and the improbable triumphs of New Orleans collectively transformed not only the country's internal consciousness, but also its global image. Abroad, diplomats and merchants recognized that America had survived the most powerful military empire of its era, not through sheer luck, but through strategic resilience, ingenuity, and unity. This recognition was slow to emerge, but increasingly undeniable, as reports of American perseverance and battlefield acumen filtered across Europe. Scholars, naval officers, and political observers marveled at the nation's capacity to mobilize militia, integrate irregular fighters, and utilize both geography and ingenuity to defend critical positions. At home, citizens who had endured invasion, occupation, and bombardment began to take pride not merely in survival, but in the fact that survival had been achieved through a combination of courage, coordination, and ingenuity. The lessons of the war became embedded in American culture and education. Children learned of the defenders of Fort McHenry, the resourcefulness of privateers, and the leadership of Andrew Jackson as more than historical facts. They were moral examples, models of courage, ingenuity, and patriotic loyalty. Cities and towns rebuilt themselves with renewed determination, reflecting a belief that no enemy could permanently intimidate or subjugate the nation. Maritime trade flourished anew, with shipyards and ports adapting lessons from wartime blockades to develop resilience and efficiency, demonstrating that national strength relied not only on military preparedness, but also on economic and civic robustness. Meanwhile, Britain, reflecting on the unexpected tenacity of its former colony, reassessed the United States' standing. Historians and policymakers began to acknowledge that the American experiment was not a temporary rebellion, but a nation capable of self-governance, capable of defending its sovereignty, and increasingly capable of influencing events on the global stage. Cultural exchange began to flourish. American literature, newspapers, and political thought reached British audiences, while British innovations in law, commerce, and the arts found eager American readers. Diplomacy evolved accordingly, with both nations recognizing that conflict was costly and cooperation potentially far more beneficial. This cautious yet emerging respect laid the groundwork for trade agreements, alliances, and collaboration in the decades that followed. The American public, aware of this changing perception abroad, grew increasingly confident in its identity and its role in international affairs. National celebrations, songs, and monuments commemorated wartime resilience, embedding the war's lessons into the civic consciousness. Beyond the tangible aspects of politics, trade, and military preparation, the psychological impact of the war was profound. A nation that had survived humiliation and emerged with pride internalized a sense of invincibility, rooted not in arrogance, but in experience, endurance, and solidarity. Citizens came to see themselves as part of a narrative larger than individual states or local concerns, a narrative of a young republic tested and tempered in the fires of conflict, capable of confronting both internal challenges and external threats with courage and cohesion. Across the Atlantic, Britain's perception of America shifted subtly but permanently. What had once been seen as a peripheral, rebellious territory was now understood to be a nation with legitimate claims to sovereignty, capable of self-defense, and worthy of respect. The stage was set for a long-term transformation. America's war-tested confidence, combined with a reluctant British admiration, became the invisible architecture of future diplomacy, trade, cultural exchange, and the eventual emergence of the Anglo-American partnership known as the Special Relationship. This period cemented a critical truth, both for Americans and for the global audience observing from afar. Nations forged in adversity gain enduring strength, and reputation, respect, and identity are often the greatest spoils of survival and strategic endurance. The War of 1812 had ended, but its consequences, deeply ingrained in national consciousness and global perception, would echo for generations, shaping policy, culture, and the American belief in its own destiny as a resilient, sovereign, and confident superpower.
In the wake of the War of 1812, the United States entered a period of introspection, reflection, and cautious optimism, recognizing that survival alone was insufficient for a nation aspiring to permanence, influence, and respect on the global stage. While the immediate horrors of battles, burned cities, and displaced communities had receded into memory, the lessons endured, shaping policy, civic identity, and military doctrine. The war had revealed critical weaknesses in the young republic's infrastructure, logistics, and strategic planning, and leaders across political, military, and civil spheres recognized the urgent need for reform and preparedness. Fortifications along the coastlines were strengthened, coastal batteries and naval shipyards expanded, and militia training programs standardized to ensure rapid mobilization in the event of future threats. Leaders like Andrew Jackson, whose heroism at New Orleans had captured the imagination of the public, became emblematic of the qualities deemed essential for national survival: decisiveness, strategic ingenuity, and an unyielding resolve to defend the homeland. Yet the lessons of the war extended beyond military preparation. Economically, the blockade and trade disruptions underscored the need for self-sufficiency, domestic manufacturing, and resilient infrastructure, prompting investments in shipbuilding, transportation networks, and industrial development. Towns and cities that had been devastated rebuilt not merely to restore their previous states, but to serve as stronger, more resilient centers of commerce, governance, and civic life. In education and public discourse, the war became a foundation for teaching civic responsibility, patriotism, and the costs of freedom, embedding the experiences of ordinary citizens and soldiers into the collective memory of the nation. Families recounted the courage of their ancestors. Communities held ceremonies commemorating victories and sacrifices, and the stories of privateers, militia, and frontier defenders became as celebrated as the exploits of generals and political leaders. Diplomatically, the conflict had imparted lessons in negotiation, the necessity of reliable alliances, and the recognition that even a victorious nation must temper its pride with pragmatism to secure long-term stability. Britain, likewise, emerged with hard-earned respect for the resilience, ingenuity, and national identity of its former colony. Observers in London, once dismissive of America as a fledgling republic, came to acknowledge a nation capable of self-determination, defense, and growing influence in global affairs. This new recognition fostered cautious cooperation, opening avenues for trade, cultural exchange, and eventually political partnership that would culminate centuries later in the special relationship. The war had also exposed the complex dynamics with Native American nations, whose alliances, sacrifices, and losses profoundly affected the geopolitical landscape of North America. The United States, now more conscious of its expansionist ambitions and the consequences for indigenous populations, faced both moral and strategic decisions that would influence domestic and foreign policy for decades. Socially and culturally, Americans internalized a sense of identity born from adversity. Surviving the burning of the Capitol, the bombardment of key cities, and the formidable naval engagements on lakes and rivers reinforced a collective understanding that freedom required vigilance, sacrifice, and unity. Civic pride, already developing during the Revolutionary era, was solidified through shared suffering and triumph, and symbols such as the flag, the Star-Spangled Banner, and the stories of heroic individuals became anchors for a growing national ethos. Literature, journalism, and public oratory immortalized these experiences, ensuring that subsequent generations internalized not only the events themselves, but also the principles of courage, resilience, and moral fortitude. As the United States looked westward and outward toward the world, the lessons of 1812 shaped its strategic vision.
a recognition that survival depended on preparedness, economic resilience, diplomatic acumen, and the capacity to inspire citizens with shared purpose and identity. The War of 1812, though often overlooked by historians in comparison to larger European conflicts, became in hindsight a crucible in which a fledgling nation's character was tested and refined. The trials faced, victories achieved, and sacrifices endured provided a roadmap for how the United States would navigate the complexities of sovereignty, governance, and international engagement. In essence, the war had fortified the nation not merely through physical rebuilding, but by instilling confidence, unity, and the strategic wisdom necessary to assert its place in a world dominated by empires. It demonstrated unequivocally that a nation forged through adversity could emerge stronger, more cohesive, and more capable of defending its ideals, setting the stage for America's eventual rise as a superpower whose influence would resonate across continents and generations, grounded in the hard-earned lessons of courage, resilience, and vision from the tumultuous years of the War of 1812.
As the cannons fell silent and the echoes of musket fire faded from forests, rivers, and cities, the United States and Britain began to confront a new reality, one that extended far beyond the battlefields where blood and fire had once defined the course of history. The Treaty of Ghent had ended the formal hostilities, yet both nations recognized that survival and victory alone were insufficient to secure long-term security, prosperity, and influence. In the immediate aftermath, trade and commerce became the first testing grounds for a cautious reconciliation, with merchants on both sides eager to recover losses and reestablish the networks disrupted by years of blockade, naval skirmishes, and territorial insecurity. American ports that had once faced British blockades now bustled with renewed activity, as ships laden with goods and raw materials navigated the Atlantic, carrying not just commerce, but the promise of renewed connections, exchange of ideas, and mutual prosperity. British merchants likewise recalibrated their approach to the American market, realizing that the former colonies were no longer peripheral trading posts, but sovereign partners whose cooperation could enhance, rather than threaten, imperial economic interests. Beyond commerce, diplomacy became the subtle battlefield where nations tested each other's intentions, patience, and capacity for negotiation. Ambassadors and envoys, once accustomed to dealing with a fractious, rebellious former colony, now engaged with a nation whose confidence had been forged in the fire of war, whose leaders understood both the power and limitations of their young republic. Negotiations were no longer dictated solely by Britain's empire-wide interests. Americans had demonstrated that their voice carried weight and their perspective could not be ignored. The interplay of diplomacy and strategy became increasingly sophisticated, blending formal agreements with unspoken understandings, shared respect, and recognition of each other's enduring capabilities. Culturally, the post-war period revealed a fascinating evolution. Literature, music, and intellectual discourse began to cross the Atlantic more freely, with American newspapers reporting on British parliamentary debates and British publications commenting on the political developments of the United States. Ideas about governance, trade policy, and civic responsibility flowed in both directions, strengthening bonds that had once been defined by rivalry and resentment. This exchange was not merely academic. It shaped the policies, ambitions, and social consciousness of both nations, ensuring that the lessons of war were internalized not only as historical memory, but as practical guidance for the future. The war's legacy in this domain was profound. It had demonstrated that even bitter adversaries could evolve into partners when guided by pragmatism, mutual respect, and a recognition of shared interests. Beyond trade and diplomacy, the geopolitical implications were significant. The United States, having endured attacks on its capital, invasions along its northern border, and naval challenges on the Great Lakes, now understood the necessity of a strategic military posture balanced with diplomatic agility. Britain, having faced unexpected resistance and logistical challenges far from its home territory, gained a renewed appreciation for the strategic complexity of North America and the resilience of its former colonies. This mutual understanding laid the groundwork for a century-long evolution in international relations, culminating in cooperation during global conflicts, coordinated trade policies, and eventually a deep political and military alliance that historians today recognize as the precursor to the special relationship, that alaka. Socially, the citizens of both nations internalized these lessons in subtle but meaningful ways. American families, inspired by tales of bravery, innovation, and sacrifice, imbued subsequent generations with a sense of responsibility to uphold national honor, resilience, and the capacity for constructive engagement with former enemies. British society, in parallel, began to regard Americans with a mixture of respect, curiosity, and recognition of shared heritage, seeing them not as rebellious upstarts, but as capable, resourceful, and ultimately reliable partners on the global stage. Through commerce, diplomacy, intellectual exchange, and cultural interaction, a fragile but promising connection had begun to take root, transforming the legacy of a violent conflict into the foundation for cooperation, strategic understanding, and mutual benefit across centuries. The War of 1812 had proven that adversity could generate not only resilience, but also the wisdom necessary for sustainable alliances, that conflict could evolve into collaboration, and that respect earned in the crucible of battle could shape relationships for generations. In essence, the war had created a living laboratory for international relations, demonstrating that nations, like individuals, can transform rivalry into respect, hostility into partnership, and shared history into a foundation for enduring trust, prosperity, and influence across centuries. It was in this delicate but profound transformation that the true long-term victory of the War of 1812 could be seen, the forging of a framework in which America, tempered by fire, and Britain, tempered by recognition, would navigate the complex world of global power not as adversaries, but as allies, collaborators, and mutual guarantors of peace, commerce, and shared ideals for generations to come.
Beyond the battles, treaties, and diplomatic maneuverings, the War of 1812 left an indelible mark on the cultural consciousness of the United States, shaping a national identity that was as much symbolic and psychological as it was political or military. For the citizens who had lived through invasions, bombardments, and occupations, the war became a touchstone of resilience and ingenuity. Communities that had rebuilt after the burning of Washington or the bombardment of coastal towns imbued their architecture, public spaces, and civic ceremonies with symbols of endurance, pride, and unity. Families recounted stories of ancestors who had defended homes, protected neighbors, and participated in militia skirmishes along rivers, lakes, and forests, passing these tales down as moral exemplars for future generations. The young republic internalized these experiences as formative, teaching that freedom was never free, that vigilance was an obligation, and that courage could manifest in both ordinary and extraordinary forms. Music, poetry, and the written word flourished as vessels for preserving the memory of the war. Francis Scott Key's Star-Spangled Banner, inspired by the bombardment of Fort McHenry, became more than a song. It emerged as a defining symbol of national perseverance, hope, and unity. Artists depicted scenes of valor, suffering, and triumph, ensuring that even the most distant citizens could internalize the lessons and heroism of the conflict. Newspapers chronicled not just military victories, but also the resilience of communities, the cleverness of privateers, and the moral fortitude of everyday citizens, creating a narrative that combined triumph with reflection. These cultural artifacts cultivated a sense of shared identity across states, regions, and social classes, reinforcing that American citizenship was rooted in collective sacrifice and responsibility. Across the Atlantic, Britain also experienced cultural reflection. While the war had been difficult and costly, the stories of American courage, strategic ingenuity, and the fortitude of its population garnered respect among scholars, writers, and policymakers. British literature and journalism began to portray Americans not merely as rebellious colonists, but as a people capable of self-governance, creativity,
and resilience. This mutual awareness fostered early cultural connections, laying the groundwork for intellectual exchange, artistic influence, and shared appreciation that would evolve over the decades. Education in America incorporated the lessons of the war into curricula, emphasizing not only strategy and governance, but also the moral and civic responsibilities of citizens in sustaining the nation. Children learned of the defenders of New Orleans, the militia along the northern frontier, and the sacrifices of families displaced by conflict, internalizing ideals of perseverance, duty, and national pride. Civic ceremonies, annual commemorations, and monuments reinforced the collective memory, ensuring that the war's significance extended beyond immediate survival to the cultivation of a robust national ethos. The war also underscored the importance of regional collaboration, demonstrating that victories and endurance were often achieved through the coordination of states, communities, and local militias. This realization strengthened the sense of national unity, forging bonds across diverse regions that had previously been divided by local loyalties or economic interests. In broader terms, the War of 1812 demonstrated that cultural memory and identity are as powerful as armies in sustaining a nation's sovereignty. The stories, songs, and symbols that emerged from the conflict became a form of soft power, shaping the psychological and moral framework of the American people while simultaneously influencing global perceptions of the Republic. Britain, witnessing the resilience and innovation displayed by its former colonies, began to adjust its expectations, recognizing that diplomacy, mutual respect, and cultural engagement could be more effective than force in managing relations with the United States. In this sense, the war's impact extended far beyond the battlefield. It shaped education, civic identity, culture, and international perception, embedding lessons of courage, unity, and resilience into the very fabric of the nation. By intertwining the experiences of ordinary citizens, military leaders, and international observers, the War of 1812 forged a layered and enduring national identity. Americans emerged not only victorious in survival, but conscious of the values, sacrifices, and responsibilities required to sustain freedom, sovereignty, and respect on the global stage. The cultural resonance of the conflict became a bridge between generations, ensuring that the moral, strategic, and emotional lessons of the war would guide political, social, and diplomatic choices for decades, reinforcing the idea that the strength of a nation lies as much in its people, values, and shared memory as in its armies, navies, or fortifications. In this way, the War of 1812, once dismissed as forgotten, established the foundations for a confident, resilient, and culturally self-aware America, ready to engage the world on its own terms, carrying the fire of endurance, ingenuity, and pride across generations.